Welcome to Military Analytics. The war between Russia and Ukraine is locked on the eastern axis. Kiev troops are advancing in Bakhmut in the Donetsk region. There's talk of impending fall eddies in Bakhmut. Details are limited, and the situation is subject to change at any time. But the fierce battle for the city of Bakhmut may end soon. The sudden offensive operations launched by the Ukrainian armed forces under the leadership of the Azov regiment last week surprised the Russian troops. Russian soldiers, who did not expect a sudden offensive operation from Ukraine, retreated to their positions at some points. Some Russian troops even abandoned their positions and tried to escape from the city. The escape, touted as a tactical retreat by the Russian Ministry of Defense, did not escape the attention of the Wagner leader. Yevgeny Prigozhin denied the allegations of the Russian Defense Ministry. Prigozhin stated that the Russian soldiers fled, exposing the wings of the city while the Russians were struggling with these problems in Bakhmut. The Ukrainian troops continued to advance with firm steps. The advance of Ukraine meant casualties for the Russian army multiplied exponentially. The offensive operations of the Kiev forces were supported by artillery and rocket units supported by HIMARS. Successful artillery and rocket fire hit the Russian formations from exactly 12. Russian troops had experienced déjà vu the other day. Russian casualties were increasing daily. In the last 24 hours in the Bakhmut region, Ukrainian forces have carried out 12 airstrikes and more than 30 missile and ground attacks on Russian positions. The sounds of artillery and rocket shots rang all over the city. Weapons accompanied the chorus of cannon and rocket sounds. The situation of the Russian soldiers was very difficult in Bakhmut, where the blood pressure did not decrease even for a minute. 92 Russian soldiers who could not resist the attacks of Ukraine were eliminated. 156 Russian soldiers were also wounded. The focus of the Ukrainian attacks was on the Russian arsenals and key command positions. Destroying enemy logistics is Ukraine's specialty. The main task of the Ukrainian HIMARS and artillery units was to wipe out the Russian arsenals off the map. With the successful HIMARS attacks and the support of the Air Force, Ukraine destroyed 13 Russian arsenals in just 24 hours. There were huge explosions when their ammunition exploded. After the explosions, black smoke filled the skies of Bakhmut. Concrete piles remained in place of ammunition depots. In addition, the Ukrainian armed forces destroyed 2 infantry vehicles, 5 artillery installations, a Gvozdika self-propelled howitzer, and 5 unmanned aerial vehicles belonging to the Russian troops in their latest offensive. Recent casualties limit the operational capabilities of the Russian troops. Ukrainian Armed Forces Eastern Group spokesperson Sergei Sharavathy stated that the Russian forces had much more shells at the beginning of the mass attack. Sergei Sharavathy stated that Russian troops fired an average of 33,000 to 35,000 rounds per day near Bakhmut and Kupiansk. Although the Russians have limited their operational capabilities, they have not completely abandoned Bakhmut. According to UK defense officials, Russia has redoubled its efforts to take Bakhmut by increasing the number of troops deployed to the town of Donetsk. Defense officials said the redeployment represented a significant commitment by the Russian command. A separate assessment by the Institute for War Studies stated that the chances of Russian forces besieging the area had stalled as the conflicts continue. War-related evaluations are also coming from various organizations and officials. In another development, U.S. officials plan that the Russia-Ukraine war is more likely to escalate into a years-long frozen conflict and join their ranks in similar lengthy encounters across the Korean Peninsula, South Asia, and beyond. Among the options discussed within the Biden administration for a long-term freeze is where to draw potential lines that Ukraine and Russia would agree not to cross, but which would not necessarily be official borders. Given that neither Kiev nor Moscow seems inclined to admit defeat, this is a scenario that could prove the most realistic long-term outcome. Also, the growing perception within the administration that an impending Ukrainian counterattack will not deal Russia a fatal blow is becoming more and more likely. A frozen conflict in which conflicts stall, but neither side is declared victorious, and the war is officially over could also be a politically acceptable long-term outcome for the United States and other countries that support Ukraine. The U.S. officials stated that they are planning a long-term conflict, whether it appears frozen or thawed. This type of planning is a growing focus of management, he said. However, the official stated that everything was urgent and short-term in the past months. Two other U.S. officials and a former Biden administration official confirmed that a prolonged freeze on conflict was one of the possibilities the U.S. was preparing for. U.S. officials are considering the long-term security ties Washington will have with Kyiv, as well as Ukraine's relationship with the NATO military alliance. U.S. officials emphasize that the war will remain hot for a while and that the Biden administration intends to provide Ukraine with the weapons and support it needs. With this emphasis, it shows that such discussions are in the early stages. Yet even such a planning proposal could undermine the confidence of Ukrainian leaders in their commitment to American causes. Speaking on behalf of the White House, a senior Biden administration official said a number of contingency plans were being evaluated. However, the official said the situation is volatile and the only safe prediction is that Russia will not conquer Ukraine. Many U.S. officials have avoided speaking publicly about how the Russian-Ukraine conflict will develop. General Mark Milley, the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, has repeatedly predicted that this will result in negotiations, not a military victory, for either side. A Defense Department official said the nature of recent military aid packages to Ukraine reflects the Biden administration's shift to a longer-term strategy. The amount of equipment shipped directly from U.S. existing stockpiles has steadily decreased over the past few months, while aid packages used to purchase new weapons from the industry have increased. The Biden administration recently transferred $300 million worth of weapons from existing U.S. stockpiles, primarily ammunition. Management provided $1.2 billion for the purchase of more complex weapons from the industry, such as air defense systems. Currently, Ukraine is preparing a large-scale counteroffensive against Russia. However, its timing remains unclear. In recent days, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has suggested that the counterattack will be delayed because Ukraine needs more weapons from its Western partners. Zelensky stated that the first important steps will be taken soon. U.S. officials expect the war to continue after the counterattack. In the medium term, many see a stalemate in which the conflict continues, but neither side has gained much ground, or a war of attrition is expected in which both sides try to inflict huge losses of personnel and equipment on the other side in the hope that the enemy will not return. The performance of Ukraine and Russia depends on sometimes uncontrollable factors from air superiority to who is responsible in the Kremlin. A U.S. official stressed that the administration always plans both long-term and short-term possibilities. The longer the conflict lasts, the more likely it is that Russia and Ukraine will feel international and domestic pressure to negotiate a ceasefire or other legal mechanisms to stop the war, even if it does not officially end the war. Some U.S. officials and analysts suggest that a rough model might be the Korean War. Active fighting in this conflict ended with a ceasefire in 1953. But even after 70 years, the war has not been officially declared. A former Biden administration official said a Korean-style stop when it comes to Ukraine is definitely something that's being discussed by experts and analysts inside and outside the government. Also, such paused wars occasionally restart. The ceasefire signed in 1994 between Azerbaijan and Armenia over the Nagorno-Karabakh region continued, albeit imperfectly, until violent clashes broke the peace in 2020. The two countries are now trying to negotiate. In any case, Western intervention also changes. A former U.S. intelligence official who has covered issues with Russia suggested that Biden aides seem more willing to discuss long-term security guarantees for Ukraine these days. Ukraine wants to join NATO, and the Secretary General of the military alliance has stated that he has agreed that its members will eventually join if Ukraine's bid for NATO membership stalls. Such guarantees could range from a NATO-style Article 5 mutual defense agreement to Israeli-style arms deals with Ukraine as a deterrent against Russia. Some current and former U.S. officials say that at least the Ukrainian military should receive special attention. This may include ensuring that Ukraine's weapons and equipment are compatible with NATO countries and joint training, even if Kyiv is not in a military alliance. U.S. officials emphasized that they tried to avoid black-and-white thinking while planning the course of the Russia-Ukraine war. Thanks to a massive operation by the Ukrainian army, a 250-strong Russian convoy was neutralized. This operation of the Ukrainian army led to a fight between the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, and the Russian Chief of Staff, Valery Gerasimov. The war between Russia and Ukraine is now over a year old. There has been a major development on the Bakhmut front. where the occupying Russian forces have been intensively attacking. Russian troops have been trying to capture the city of Bakhmut for weeks, but Ukrainian forces do not allow this. The 42-kilometer defense line that the Ukrainian army has built on the Bakhmut city border does not allow Russian forces to enter, realizing that they could not cross this defense line by land. The Russian army decided to launch airstrikes on the city of Bakhmut. The occupying Russian forces wanted to launch an airstrike on the city of Bakhmut with helicopters and fighter jets from Solder. But the air defense systems deployed by the Ukrainian army in Bakhmut prevented this attack. Ukrainian forces had planned in advance to prevent airstrikes by Russian forces by deploying Patriot and HIMARS missile systems behind their defense lines. Unaware of the air defense systems, the Russian army carried out a large-scale operation in Bakhmut with 3 Su-25 fighter jets and 4 Mi-28 helicopters. Russian pilots entered the airspace of the Ukrainian army as Russian forces entered Bakhmut airspace. The air defense systems installed in the city became active. Missiles were fired, one after the other, aimed at Russian fighter jets and helicopters. 2 of the missiles hit a Russian Su-25 fighter jet and a Russian combat helicopter. The helicopter and the plane, which started to burn after the missiles hit, crashed to the ground. As soon as the pilots of other aircraft saw the aircraft crashing to the ground, they decided to retreat, not knowing that there was an air defense system in Bakhmut. Russian pilots tried to survive by retreating without waiting for orders from their commanders. This failed. Airstrikes by the Russian army infuriated Vladimir Putin, and Putin, who had not been able to capture the city of Bakhmut for months, decided to send a large military-supported Russian army to Bakhmut. Valery Gerasimov, the commander of the Russian army, by order of Vladimir Putin, decided to send 10 Russian T-72 tanks and more than 250 Russian soldiers to the Russian troops in Bakhmut. The Russian convoy departed from the Russian-occupied city of Mariupol and moved to complete the occupation of the city of Bakhmut. Putin thought that with Russian tanks, the Ukrainian army would be able to break through the defense line more easily. Thanks to the Ukrainian army's supporters in Mariupol, it was learned that a large Russian convoy was on its way from this region with the information received by the Ukrainian intelligence service. The Ukrainian army took action and planned to destroy this military shipment of Russian forces. Ukrainian soldiers knew that the Russian convoy would have to pass through the city of Vlada to reach the Bakhmut front. The shortest route to Bakhmut was the forested road, and Ukrainian soldiers first laid a large number of mines on the road that the Russian forces would have to cross. They placed mines both on the transportation route and around the forest, preparing a big ambush for the Russian army. Ukrainian soldiers placed a large number of mortars around the road. Ukrainian forces tracked every movement of the Russian convoy with unmanned aerial drones. As soon as the Russian convoy entered the forested road, the operation was launched. In the Russian convoy consisting of 15 armored vehicles and 10 Russian tanks, one of the Russian tanks stepped on the mines placed by the Ukrainian army. Unmanned warplanes following the Russian convoy fired missiles at the Russian tank, which was on the move at the front. Russian soldiers were surprised when the Russian tank exploded. Russian soldiers got out of armored vehicles and tanks and took cover. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian army continued to attack the Russian forces with artillery fire. Russian soldiers hiding behind armored vehicles started to run around when they saw the Ukrainian army started artillery shelling. When the Russian soldiers started to run around, they stepped on the mines placed by Ukrainian soldiers and started to blow up. When the Russian soldiers started to run towards the forest, Ukrainian soldiers hiding in the forest emerged and started shooting at the Russian soldiers. As the Russian soldiers caught in the crossfire ran around, the mines planted by Ukrainian soldiers exploded. This operation, organized by the Ukrainian army, was recorded moment by unmanned aerial vehicles. During the operation, Russian tanks and armored vehicles were destroyed, and more than 200 Russian soldiers were killed. But the real incident took place after this operation. The ambush of the Russian convoy angered Vladimir Putin so much that he had a fight with Russian General Valery Gerasimov. The footage of the operation, which was shared on social media platforms and Reddit, was watched by Russian citizens, and Vladimir Putin became very agitated. Seeing this failure of the Russian army, Russian citizens would become even angrier with Putin, and his leadership would be questioned. Aware of this situation, Putin decided to hold an urgent meeting in the Kremlin and called Valery Gerasimov, the Russian chief of general staff responsible for the shipment, and many senior officials to the meeting. Vladimir Putin held Gerasimov, the commander of the Russian army, accountable for this failure. Recently, many officials in the Kremlin believe that Valery Gerasimov is not managing the Russian army well. After this failed deployment, there has been talk that Putin will remove Gerasimov from his post. The lack of intelligence of the Russian army on Ukrainian territory is giving Russian forces a very difficult time. The Ukrainian intelligence service ensured that the Russian army was dealt another big blow with the information it obtained. Recently, the unsuccessful operations of the Russian army on Ukrainian territory are often on the agenda. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is very tired of the failures of the Russian army on Ukrainian soil, having lost more than 150,000 Russian soldiers in Ukraine since the beginning of the war. Putin's patience is running out. US and Ukrainian officials say that Vladimir Putin will attack Ukraine in mid-March with an army of 300,000 to 500,000 men, according to Ukrainian officials. This attack will be coordinated from the city of Bakhmut. In other words, the main reason why the Russian army wants the city of Bakhmut so much is that Bakhmut is a blueprint for a new attack on Ukraine in the spring. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is mobilized to replace his losses in Ukraine. At the moment, the Russian people are very afraid of Putin's decision to mobilize again. Many Russian citizens are holding money in banks with Putin's mobilization decision. Russian citizens have started preparations to leave the country. Sources close to the Kremlin said that Putin would announce a massive mobilization before such an attack and would recruit more than 300,000 new soldiers for the Russian army. The spread of this news in Russia has made Russian citizens very nervous. Many more analysts say that Russian leader Vladimir Putin wants to withdraw from Ukraine but is afraid of being disgraced in the world. Vladimir Putin continues to send Russian citizens to Ukraine to die because he is afraid of being disgraced. The vast majority of Russian soldiers who go to fight on Ukrainian soil do not want to fight. This unwillingness to fight in the Russian army is leading to more failures of the Russian army in Ukraine. The heart of the Ukrainian war beats in Bakhmut, the stronghold of the eastern front line. In this small city, Russian troops and the Wagner paramilitary group are cornered. A fierce Ukrainian counterattack in the Bakhmut area destroyed Russian tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade was supported by T-64 tanks and M113 armored personnel carriers. Soldiers from Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade destroyed a chain of Russian defensive positions southwest of Bakhmut in fierce and close combat. As a result of the fighting, the brigade advanced the Ukrainian-controlled area towards the Bakhmut River. Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin reported in an angry video post that the 72nd Motor Rifle Brigade, which was holding positions in the region, had left the fortifications. Yevgeny Prigozhin accused the 72nd Motor Rifle Brigade of allowing Ukrainian troops to encircle the positions of his group. The Wagner leader claimed that he had lost 500 of his soldiers because the Russian brigade had abandoned its positions. Prigozhin said that in a one-day conflict, Russian forces in the Bakhmut region had to leave a 2-kilometer deep and 6-kilometer long battlefield. Many sources connected with the 3rd Assault Brigade confirmed most details of Prigozhin's allegations. The 3rd Assault Brigade is a former regional defense unit raised from elements of the Azov Regiment in Kiev in the early days of the war, and is now a senior Ukrainian Armed Forces assault unit. This brigade is a veteran formation with long experience at the front. Drone video released by Azov's media division shows well-equipped soldiers in US-made Vietnam-era M113 armored personnel carriers attacking flattened Russian defensive positions. Video footage shows the soldiers descending from the air and carrying out fire and motion attacks supported by automatic weapon fire. Video footage showed tanks firing at Russian positions at close range and infantry from the 3rd Assault Brigade bypassing the casualties at Russian positions. Some individual troop shipments showed casualties along with identification and name tags of the Russian paratrooper unit. Multiple sources stated that the 3rd Assault Brigade captured Russian war vehicles and prisoners as a result of the attacks. According to a statement from a unit, at least 64 Russian soldiers were killed in the attack, including casualties. In the last attacks, the Russian army lost about 197 soldiers. Azov Battalion founder Andriy Beletsky stated that the amount of Russian equipment and soldiers detained by Ukrainians is significant. Ukrainian Ground Forces Commander Oleksandr Kursky announced that Russian troops had retreated up to 2 kilometers in parts of the front in the eastern Donetsk region. Unable to hold on to Ukraine's counterattack, Russian troops find their way back in retreat. However, the fortress city of Bakhmut continues to provide the Russian forces with slices of hell. The video footage shared on social media platforms the other day reveals the impasse of the Russians. A video clip shared by the 45th Separate Artillery Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces shows the moment when Ukrainian forces captured the Russian Pantsir missile system. The video shows the missile system being moved by Russian soldiers on the way to the settlement. The video shows 2 cars parked close to each other on the residential road. Vehicles and soldiers are surrounded by demolished residential buildings. The soldiers were startled by an explosion to the left of the vehicles. The explosion caused 3 people to flee the scene. It is seen that a small Russian vehicle escaped as a result of the explosion. After the Russian soldiers left the scene, the missile system appears to have been engulfed in flames as the fire disperses. The missile system continues to emit huge clouds of thick, dark smoke. Additional footage recorded from afar shows the smoke rising hundreds of feet into the air. A look at the Pantsir system long after the attack reveals that it has turned into a warped pile of metal. The Russian army is losing important systems as a result of the attack. It is a matter of curiosity how the Russian army, which has a shortage of ammunition, will cope with the latest losses. Why are Pantsir missile systems important to the Russian military? Russia's Pantsir is a family of surface-to-air missile systems used by the Russian military since 2012. The missiles made headlines recently when President Vladimir Putin accused Ukrainian forces of trying to mount 2 drone strikes on the Kremlin. Unmanned aerial vehicles were intercepted by Pantsir missile systems installed in various spots of the country's capital. Missile systems seem to be installed on the roofs of cathedrals and other important buildings in Moscow. The Pantsir missile system includes several variations of the weapon, some mounted on the 8x8 Kamaz truck chassis, while others mounted on the GM series track chassis. Each Pantsir system can carry up to 12 missiles, while the loss of soldiers and equipment in the Russian army is shaking. ATACMS missiles are coming to Ukraine. According to reports, the UK is close to sending long-range missiles to Ukraine that can reach deep into Russian lines, including on the Crimean Peninsula. The search for missiles with longer ranges than Kiev's current munitions finally seems close to a successful end. While some sources have yet to make a final decision, the UK may be turning to the Storm Shadow arsenal, an air-launched cruise missile. The Ukrainian army is about to launch a large-scale counteroffensive, and any new weapon system could help. And now that the UK appears ready to break ground once again and send the first new weapon systems to Ukraine, the US military may be under pressure once again to send the MBM-140 Army Tactical Missile System ATACMS. ATACMS can be fired from the M142 High Mobility Artillery Rocket System or the M270 Multiple Launch Rocket System. ATACMS can reach targets 190 miles away. U.S. officials do not appear ready to hand over ATACMS and give it to Ukraine, even if the UK continues and provides long-range munitions with similar capabilities. The main argument against sending ATACMS to Ukraine is that the U.S. military has a limited number of long-range ammunition. U.S. officials argue that delivering any of their ATACMS to Ukraine would leave the U.S. military in a weaker position. Chief of Staff General Mark Milley gave an interview a few weeks ago. Mark Milley said, "From a military standpoint, we have relatively few ATACMS. We have to make sure we maintain our own ammunition inventory as well." The war in Ukraine underlined how valuable precision munitions are for a modern army. Although the U.S. has the most advanced military power in the world, its ammunition stocks are limited. As the world's superpower, the United States must be prepared to respond to contingencies in many parts of the world. For example, as tensions with China continue to escalate over Taiwan, the U.S. military needs to be prepared to fight in the Indo-Pacific. U.S. officials continue to hesitate to send certain weapons systems to Ukraine, including longer-range munitions that can hit targets on Russian soil for fear of escalation. Since the beginning of the war, Ukrainian forces have repeatedly attacked targets of military value behind the front lines. The White House assesses that if Kyiv receives advanced weapons systems and Ukrainian forces use them to attack targets inside Russia, the Kremlin could use this as an excuse to escalate the war even further. It seems that it's not yet possible for us to talk about a permanent ceasefire and peace in the war between Russia and Ukraine. As tensions rise on the front lines day by day, the armies are trying to do their best. Kiev forces are making significant gains on the Eastern Front. If the gains of Kiev are supported by Western munitions, the strength of the Russian army and counteroffensive operations will be rendered ineffective. How much do you think Ukraine's highly anticipated counteroffensive might affect Russian troops? Please do not forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on your notifications to be instantly informed about new developments. Thank you for watching us.